Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. How many times you've been walking down the street and you get to your destination, or maybe even down a hallway, and you feel something on the bottom of your shoe, and you lift your shoe up, and there it sits. A hunk of gum that came out of somebody's mouth, and they just deposited it on the side of the street where you're walking. Or even worse, have you ever been to a theater and you sat down in a seat and you realize that when you get up to get more popcorn or go to the restroom, it's a bit more difficult to get up because somebody left bubble gum in the seat? Amazing. I've never been one to do that, but obviously there are people out there that do. Some do it because they just don't have a garbage can nearby, or I guess some of them do it because they think it'd be funny. Today, we're going to talk about a couple of cases that, interestingly enough, have become adherent over the years, just like your foot does, to a discarded stick of gum. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, you got a favorite type of gum?
Oh, man. Bubblicious, probably, or Hubba Bubba, one of those. Yeah.
Hubba Bubba.
Yeah.
Man, I hadn't heard that in a long time. You know what my favorite was
What?
when I was a kid? Fruit Stripe.
Really?
I loved Fruit Stripe. The problem with Fruit Stripe, though, the flavors never lasted long enough. You just wanted to go on and on forever and ever.
It's so funny, man.
Then I became a big Red fan.
Oh, dude.
Loved that,
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't chew as much gum anymore. But yeah,
it's
I've
funny.
always loved gum. But
When I saw this story pop up, Joe, I'm not kidding. I thought the gum trick, and I thought, investigators nowadays, you've got all great technology, and you've mentioned this before, but the way technology has grown, and I know that it seems very advanced now, but I keep wondering, what's it going to be like in 10 years? What was it like 10 years for us, 20 years for us, and I just can't imagine. Eventually, it's going to be where you're going to commit a crime and cops are going to show up while you're still there and just cuff you and take you away. It's all done,
Minority Report, if you ever saw that movie.
God.
Yeah.
But in this case, we had unsolved crimes. And looking back at it now, I'm thinking there's going to be a couple of people kicking themselves over not solving these earlier, because it seems like almost a one-man crime wave in Everett, Washington, from 1979 to 1984, 85. And in that pathway, you had an assault in 1979 on a woman who became a police officer. And had she not been able to get away, she'd have been a murder victim. You have a murder in 1980, another one in 84, and then you have the sexual assault of sisters. And that's where our suspect got caught with those, and not the ones before at first. So as we look at this case today, I'm thinking to myself, Joe, between 1979 and 1984, you had a 5.5-year period of time where one man rained holy terror on the women of Everett, Washington. That's shocking to me.
Yeah, it is. And, when you have serial perpetrators, many times you'll see that there are these lulls in activity. And it happens whether you're talking about somebody that's engaged in sexual assault, or you've got somebody that's perpetrating serial homicides. And, that's these gaps that you see in these behaviors. You begin to think, you know what? Where were they? What was going on? And so these gaps many times run concurrent relative to prison sentences that are going on, or maybe health problems in an individual's life, where it has kind of taken them out of the field of play, for lack of a better term.
Right.
And they're off the streets. They're not out there perpetrating anything. And so I think that this is one of those examples. And, the fact that these two sisters were subjected to this horror, kind of gives you an idea of, I think, the boldness of this individual, because a lot of these serial events that occur, the proximity, the geographic
Mhm.
proximity, kind of spreads out. Probably the most overtop example is probably Bundy. You could go back to Otis Toole. Uh, Whether he did everything along with Henry is still suspect, but they're kind of traveling about. There's been a couple of other ones, over the years, but this is a very concentrated area. If anybody's ever been to this particular region of our country, beautiful area, Everett, Washington. Um, but yeah, he did, in fact, terrorize this area. And it had to be something that I would think the locals would be aware of, and certainly the law enforcement community, and how much more so that we've got a lady that in 1979 was a victim, and she actually winds up becoming a law enforcement officer.
It's an amazing turn of events, and we'll get to her in a few minutes, okay? Because you started off with gum, and I've got to ask you something, Joe. Most of us, well, if you're watching this, okay, we're crime people, so we watch crime shows, whether it's Dateline, 48 Hours, Nancy Grace, and all the shows she's done. And we have, over time, seen how police have to get a DNA sample from a suspect. And
Yeah.
they can't just walk up to him and say, hey, spit in my hands. There has to be a legitimate way of getting it. We've seen them where they have an idea. They have something from the scene of the crime, but they've got to get a confirmation DNA from their suspect. And
Yeah.
sometimes you'll see them where these suspects know this, and they're keeping up with all their trash. Like, they don't even leave a cigarette butt behind. And you'll watch detectives following him. It's like the dude will smoke a cigarette and put it out in his hand, and he'll take it with him. Not picking up a napkin, he wiped his face with him, putting it in his pocket, stuff like that. In this case, we have just a brilliant move by a detective that allowed them to get, detectives, the investigators, to get the DNA evidence they needed from their suspect. And he gave it to them with a smile on his face. He gave it to them gladly, Joe. They tricked him in such a great way that
Yeah.
I'd never heard of this before. But when you sent it to me saying the gum trick, I knew what you were talking about. I'm like, oh, it worked, It's like the hidden ball trick
It
in
really did.
baseball.
Yeah, and for folks that aren't aware of this is one other kind of aside here. A recent case that involves something kind of similar is Huerman. Remember the discarded pizza.
Oh, yeah.
When you think about that.
Forgot
And
about
so
it.
what's at the root of all this from a biological standpoint is this saliva deposition.
Mhm.
And you don't think about, what is contained within your saliva. It's not merely salivary amylase, that actually, the digestion process actually starts in our mouth, right? We think about chewing, but also the salivary amylase that's there begins to break the food down, and all these sorts of things. That process continues. So within saliva, though, it is an evidence-rich source for DNA, and that's what it comes down to. And good on these detectives, because they recognize that early on,
Wow.
that the utility of gum. And the thing about the gum is that the gum is so, and going back to what I was talking about earlier, just stepping in it or sitting in it, or if you've ever had a child that got gum in their hair, oh my Lord, I've thought about that as well over the years. My daughters had very long hair, and they'd always want this would happen, and you have to cut it out, right? It's not just like pulling it out. Think about the tackiness of gum is that, based upon the way it is comprised, it's great for retention of this biological evidence, right?
Wow.
And so you're going to have that there. You think about the saliva,
Mhm.
that you are transferring onto that gum that is now coming out of your mouth, and it can be deposited anywhere.
Wow.
And it goes to the beauty, I think,
Yeah.
the beauty of DNA science. We think about deposition of DNA vis-a-vis saliva, but just just with touch DNA, these things that just, and this is the beauty of the trick, as you stated.
Yeah.
Um, we're so comfortable in our own skin. We're so very comfortable. Nobody thinks about if you're drinking something in, just a plastic cup, and along the rim of that cup, you got saliva that is being deposited there, and you put that cup aside, or you take it and you throw it in the trash receptacle, or you take a napkin and you wipe your face with it, you take it and you throw it away, or just leave it on the table, or whatever the case might be. Even just touch DNA where you're placing your hands on the surface of something, it's something that we're so comfortable with that we don't think about it. And that's the big thing, when it comes to perpetrators.
Yeah.
You're looking, I think, as an investigator, for an individual to put the guard down.
Right.
And in this case, that's actually what happened.
It's amazing that we'll get back to the gum in a minute, but
Yeah.
this case, what we're actually dealing with are 2 unsolved homicides that came out of Everett, Washington. We mentioned about the assault in 1979. That assault, the woman was able to save herself. She got away from the suspect. She got away from the man who was going to rape and kill her. 2 other women were not as lucky. In 1984, I'm going to start with 84 because Judy Weaver is an accomplished woman. By June 1st of 1984, she owns a small little cafe with her mom. They work really hard. She's not a wallflower. It was pointed out to me that she carried a gun and kept a gun at the restaurant, at the cafe, in the basement where she counted the daily till, because a lot of times she was going to be there by herself. And if you came to surprise her when she's counting her money, one of you was going to leave there in a bag.
She's got a surprise for you.
Yeah. And it wasn't going to be her. So she gets off work June 1st, goes home. She walks home. She stops by a Dairy Queen, gets her a little ice cream. And it's kind of interesting because that's the last time she was seen alive. It's a marker. She goes to her apartment about a little after midnight on June the 2nd, 1984. Someone uses a payphone, which I guess if you're under the age of 40, we might have to do a class and explain what that is. Used to have these phones that you didn't have a phone with you all the time. You had to stop somewhere and call. And in 1984, somebody used a payphone outside the apartment that Judy Weaver lived in and called 911. There was a fire, and the fire was really concentrated in one specific apartment. It was an apartment building that housed 5 apartments, okay? And the fire was really pouring out of one apartment in particular. It was the apartment of 42-year-old Judy Weaver. And when the firemen got there, Joe, I don't know what firemen think when they're going into a building other than we got fire, let's put it out.
Yes.
But I would imagine if it's at night, you're wondering, okay, have we accounted for everybody in this apartment building? There's 5 different apartments. Is everybody who lives here accounted for? I don't know. But when they got to Judy's apartment, they found her. She was dead, and the criminal, the suspect, lit her apartment on fire to try to destroy evidence. And Joe, when I read that, my first thought was, Justice Scott Morgan has taught me one thing. Fire doesn't get rid of evidence.
No.
It seals it. It seals the evidence.
It does. It does. And it also creates more evidence too. And that's why I teach my students, not to flee in the face of the chaos that is a fire scene, because it is truly chaos when you walk in and everything, and I mean everything in that environment looks the same to the untrained eye. It looks like if you've ever had a charcoal barbecue, for instance, if you just go look at the coals that are now burned, you'll see them in various shades of gray and black and those sorts of things. And it, for me, even as a trained forensics person, it's still confusion to me. That's why I think some of the greatest forensic scientists out there that are unheralded are our friends that are arson investigators, because you talk about true application. in the field as an investigator and then what they see at a scene. And firefighters as well, because they can pick up on things that the normal person cannot. Uh, that's one instance. This is one instance when I would refer to myself as a normal person, because they're used to being in that environment, and they become quite accustomed to it. Um, and they see things that many of us, cannot even begin to imagine. But when you walk into a scene, their central goal as firefighters is to fight the fire, right? To extinguish the fire, because you don't want it jumping anywhere else. We're talking about an apartment complex too. So there are so many other things at play here. You've got adjacent apartments where people, you run the risk of them, losing their lives. You want to see if anybody else is in the apartment, that where she is eventually found, to try to save them. But then once you get the fire extinguished, suddenly you're staring potentially at one of the most horrific things as a firefighter that you could possibly ever come across. And you're sitting there thinking, what in the world happened here? Because it is the stuff of nightmares. Brother Dave, you were talking about this case from 1984, and you used a term off air, and it has to do with time. And I beg you, please say this again.
Okay.
So that all of our friends can hear this and understand what this poor woman went through.
It was shocking. Okay. This is something that I actually brought up to Joe before we started today, because Joe and I have talked about firefighters, and Joe has talked about his deep love and affection and just reverence for firefighters. And I've begun to understand what they go through over the last couple of years in a much different way. Because when the firefighters knocked the fire down and realized they had a crime scene, they found 42-year-old Judy Weaver hogtied. And you know what that is? It's hands and behind your back, tied to your legs, so that you are 100% immobile. You can't do anything. And Joe, that to me opens up a lot of questions, because I don't know, when the firefighters come in and they see something like that, do they turn the water off? They stop?
No, they have to make the scene. They have to make the scene secure, because obviously, when you find somebody in this state, they're deceased.
Right.
And remember, the living always trump the dead. Okay. If you're in an environment like that, and that's what firefighters and EMTs understand. You have to make sure that those things that are salvageable remain salvageable. Those things that are meant to be rescued can be rescued. All right. And then they are not forensic investigators. Okay. I am. It's up to me to go back and work the scene in order to learn what I can from the human remains. Now, they play a key part, they being the firefighters, because we actually go and have a sit down with them.
That was my next question. Yeah, because I just can't imagine how that conversation goes. How do you explain what you just saw to explain something that's unexplainable, but you have to figure it out, man?
Well, yeah, and that's one of the reasons we document everybody that's at the scene. You know how you've heard people talk about, and this is in more of a static environment, but you talk about the list of, is there a young officer at the scene that's at the tape, and they're taking down everybody's name that's walking onto the scene. It's kind of like that, but even more critical here is that we're firefighters and EMTs. Many times they beat the cops to the scene. Right. Okay, if you can imagine that, going into these, and they're not armed, they're not there. They're there to try to protect life in the critical sense like that. And so they might go in, and they will, in fact, if they find someone that, they can identify as a person, they don't know if they're alive. All right. So they're going to check for vitals. They may even move the body. Well, the movement of that body, okay, is going to be critical to those of us in forensics to try to understand what the state of the body was relative to the scene in its pristine, untouched condition. Okay. So we do sit down and we get statements from firefighters, EMTs, whoever the first person is that lays eyes on the body, and that's going to be very important. And they will kind of fill in the blanks for us. They'll give us an idea. Hey, this is what we saw. You know, the flames were primarily, the hot spot was in this area. You can see right here on the wall demonstrated this is where the most damage was. We were trying to use the term knocking down. You knock down that fire. The other thing too is that fire can get up into a ceiling. I've had this happen to me before where ceiling collapsed on my head and one of the supports up there was still on fire. You couldn't see it.
Oh man.
So if you've ever, like, I'll give you an instance. I used to love to watch that show Rescue Me. And one of the reasons I liked that show is you kind of got to follow the firefighters into this environment. It wound up becoming more of a soap opera than it did a firefighter show. I would have preferred the firefighter show.
Is that the Dennis Leary show? Is that what that was? Dennis Leary?
Yeah, it's Dennis Leary. And I love Dennis. But yeah, so you'll see firefighters carry what are called pike poles, and it's a long pole that has a hook on the end. And one of the things they're doing is they're grabbing the ceiling with that, pulling it down to expose anything that's still on fire up there because you can't see
I didn't know that.
So they have to knock that down. That also brings debris upon a layer of debris upon this evidence. So when they would have seen her body, you would want to know what their first impressions were, even in that kind of really just chaotic environment. They're going to be able, they're such pros that they'll be able to say, yeah, we did note her on the floor at that time. We got the fire suppressed to that point, and then we checked her for signs of life. So, but you don't, what the question I would have is, in the pristine condition, what was she like when you first got there? Because if you moved her, then that throws the narrative all off. I want to know what this perpetrator did with her. Now, did with her is key here, because you hear hog tying in two ways. All right. So for years, law enforcement and people in mental health too. All right. Just so people understand this, people have been hog tied in mental health institutions before. And the reason they hog tie them is kind of like a straitjacket. They used to hog tie them in order to get control. Mental health stopped doing that. Police were still doing it. They recommend strongly that you no longer do it. And it's because you get somebody into a position where they get into a heightened state of agitation, anxiety, and you can have people that will actually have a heart attack. It can also compromise their ability to breathe. Now that's category 1.
Right.
Category 2 are sadists.
Oh God.
Okay. And that means that there's some kind of sadistic thing at work here. All right. And it's some kind of pseudo-sexual thing that's going on. So if you see somebody that is hogtied, and as an investigator, one of the things you're thinking, I'm dealing with somebody here that is really twisted, that they would do this to a fellow human being. And I submit to you that you can even have sadists, sexual sadists, that never actually commit a full-on sexual assault, and they will restrain somebody like this, and they derive pleasure from it, seeing the discomfort. If anybody right now that's seeing this right now, and you think about hog tying, think about how uncomfortable and how defenseless you are in that position, because it compromises your ability to breathe. It's hard to roll over, and even if you did roll over, where are you going to go? Because you can't deploy your legs, you can't deploy your arms. You're restrained in multiple ways. Your wrists are tied or anchored to your ankles. So this paints this kind of horror show
now
that she was involved in those last moments of her life.
And Joe, just focusing on this, according to the police reports and everything that came out of this, she was hogtied, beaten, and raped, sexually assaulted before she was strangled. It wasn't, I mean, it wasn't like he hogtied her to prevent her from escaping. He hogtied her as part of the assault. As part
the ritual.
Yeah. Okay. And then.
And I don't doubt that, listen, this perpetrator, again, not a behaviorist. I just know what I see at scenes.
Right.
and having worked enough serial related things, there are certain serialized behaviors that come along with this. This is probably not new territory for this person. It's either they have acted on it before or they certainly fantasized about it.
Okay.
And so that, for me, how many other cases might there be out there that were never solved that this individual could have been involved in, where you actually did have something like hog tying going on?
Well, Joe, now this case from with Judith, it didn't get solved. It happened in 1984. June, again, remember June 2nd, 1984, the 911 call comes in.
Yep.
It's in Everett, Washington. And police are working this case. They're every day trying to solve this murder. And nothing.
Yeah. Nothing whatsoever.
It just
except maybe a cigarette butt.
There you go. Okay.
Maybe a bit of carpet.
How did they get that out of this apartment? Out of this apartment, Joe? How did they come up with a cigarette butt and a piece of carpet?
That is a beautiful question, David. I got to tell you, it goes to the skill that was involved in 1984 of them recovering this, and it also draws into question how affected was her body by the flame. All right. Did you know I actually had a case involving 2 escaped prisoners that beat a photographer to death and buried him in a grave in the swamplands in New Orleans. And these guys had escaped from state pen in Florida. They always wound up in the French Quarter for some reason, either French Quarter or Vegas.
Wow.
And so they fled to New Orleans. They picked this guy up and sexually assaulted him, beat him to death with a camera tripod, dug a shallow grave. And while these idiots were digging the shallow grave, he takes the Marlboro out of his mouth that he had finished smoking and thumps it down in the grave. And then the body rolls over on it and they bury him. Okay. Think about a cigarette butt. I'm thinking about gum right now, but think about cigarette butt. Just think about the action of taking a filtered cigarette and inhaling. Okay. And what points of contact are there that are going to have biological value here? So the outer sheath of the butt itself, and then that filter, which is very complex. If you look at how these filters are made, so just your tongue touching the underside of that filter, you're actually you are depositing your saliva in here, and now it's protected. Even in the face of heat, and depending upon how quickly they got to the flame and knocked it down, that thing's preserved. But what it came down to was the evidence technician or the arson investigator that was out there looked down and said, wait, because the question is going to be, does our victim smoke? Well, if she doesn't smoke, who's been in this apartment that's thumping their cigarette butts out and leaving them there? And, the devil is always in the details, brother. You can reach down, and that thing that you might think that is so insignificant might hold the key to everything. Dave, we've told this horrible story about Judy Weaver from 1984, but there's connectivity, isn't there? Isn't it amazing how sometimes things that happen can tie back to those things in the past that kind of open up a broader picture here? And boy, in this case, do we have a tale to tell, right?
It's weird because looking back on this case, we focused on Judith Weaver because her case happened in 1984 and it went unsolved. We told you about the sisters being raped in 1984. Briefly mentioned that. We're going to come back to that in a minute because it has something to do with this. But again, Judith Weaver's case remained unsolved, Joe. As this case stayed cold, there was another case that had kind of been forgotten. Like any other business, detectives come and go. Investigators come and go, police come and go. And over the years, a case gets called. It doesn't mean that the investigation is dead or that it's not being looked at. It's just got new eyes on it.
Right.
And sometimes something that Joe or Dave might remember from 1984 well, I didn't get there. I wasn't there in 1980. I don't know what happened then.
Right.
In 1980, Susan Vesey had just celebrated her 21st birthday. She's a young married mother of two. She's got two little kids under the age of 2, Joe. They're babies, okay?
Yeah.
And again, she just turned 21 the day before. And the shocking tale to the tale is that in that apartment where Susan Vesey, her husband, is at work, somebody came into their world. He was just checking doorknobs, Joe. Walking around the neighborhood checking doorknobs. Her door happened to be unlocked. And this monster in 1980 came into her house. He tied her up, beat her, raped her, strangled her with her 2 kids in the house. 2 little babies in the house. And again, purely happenstance, Joe. The guy was just looking to do some evil.
When you think about that case and you think about the 1984 homicide, you're looking for points of connection.
Right.
You know, this matrix that's created essentially where you're trying to see, are there commonalities? And again, not disparaging the investigators from back then. You know, things change over a period of time, and you have new faces that, you know, kind of burst on the scene and these sorts of things. But what you're looking for are these points where you can kind of trace back. And it's not just about conducting a profile for the sake of having a profile. All right. Because some people view it as like a parlor trick almost.
Yeah.
It's not about that. It's about trying to connect a timeline to something. Because at the end of the day, you know, profilers do something different than forensic psychologists do. I've never talked about this on air, but with forensic psychologists, they go and they use a therapeutic model to evaluate people that are currently incarcerated. Okay. Just to kind of understand how their minds work. Profilers are dealing with an unknown. There's nobody to interview. So that's why, like with crime scenes and the forensics that are collected, that's why it all plays into it. You know, every little nuance, the position of a body, the foodstuffs that are left behind, what types of knots are used, you know, because now we've got another case that had occurred earlier that again comes back to, I think, what is sexual sadism. You've got restraint being used here. And so those tiebacks would go to what type of person would do this, and are there any other associated cases? But with this poor mother of 2 young kids, man, that answer kind of comes up and is going to play a part in this case with the 2 sisters that were assaulted. Right. And then a certain individual wound up doing time for a day.
And that's where we're headed, because we had the murder in 1980 and we had the murder in 84. Also mentioned earlier about the assault, the attempted murder in 1979, where the woman got free in her garage, okay? Well, in 1984, right, just not long after Judith Vesey's murder, these 2 girls, and again, we're in Everett, Washington, Joe. These sisters get raped. And in this particular case, they were not murdered. They were sexually assaulted, and they actually got a suspect. And this suspect ended up getting convicted. Okay? Now, they hadn't tied everything together yet. Mitchell Gaff. Mitchell Gaff was tried and convicted of the rape of the sisters in 1984. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison or so, even more than that. And he served 10 years, Joe. And at that point, after 10 years, he goes into prison in 85. It's 1995. He thinks he's getting out because he's, you know, at that point where parole happens, right? Well, because of how he was convicted and his sentence, they determined that he wasn't getting out on parole. He's going to our psychological hospital now. He needs some help. And so instead of getting out to be back on the road again, Gaff was sent to the state hospital and they kept him there for 11 years. For 21 years, Mitchell Gaff was in the custody of the state of Washington. For 21 years, Joe. There was no resolution in the Judith Weaver case. There was no resolution in the Susan Vesey case. But you mentioned those investigators did collect evidence. And because of Mitchell Gaff being convicted of a sexual assault, his DNA was eventually entered into CODIS. Now, you've mentioned this before, that having DNA, having fingerprints even, it doesn't matter if the person isn't in a national system. If they're not in the database, you can have all the DNA in the world. But if the suspect is not in the database, you're waiting. You're just waiting. Same thing.
Yeah, I'll give you even a better example of that a lot of people can understand, because many people have never been fingerprinted,
Right.
and most people, I'd say a number of people, have never had their DNA compared to anything. Think about it in this sense, all right? Think about going to the dentist, okay? How many of us have sat in a dental chair, open wider, right? What do they do when we go there? Well, they're going to take Panaflex x-rays, they're going to do the whole thing. They're going to do detailed charting, okay? Well, all of us can identify with that. Many of us can, okay, that have a dentist of record, all right? Well, let's say we come across a body out in the woods, okay, and we take that body and they still have all of their teeth intact. I can have a forensic odontologist come in and do a postmortem chart of the teeth. And it's beautiful. They've done a fantastic job. They've recognized maybe the individuals had restorations done. They might have cavitated areas in their teeth. They might have some kind of malocclusion. Teeth are going to be rotated in a certain way. You might have non-erupted molars that are there. All those things. And you've done such a good job. But guess what? It's worthless, because that person may have never been to a dentist like many of us have. All right. So in that sense, if you have this postmortem chart that you've generated, you ain't got nothing to compare it to. But in our case with Gaff, he's now in the books at this point in time. So the police are looking at these two horrific crimes that involve homicide, not just sexual assault. That's bad enough.
Right.
But you're talking about two restraint-related sadistic homicides. And these things are open, and it's in the same community.
I can't imagine.
And for all we know, this person's still walking up and down the street, right?
Yeah. And
well, when he goes into the system, they think that they might have somebody to compare it to.
They actually got a detective. Her name is Susan Logathetti. Susan Logathetti, detective on the case, starts looking at Judith Weaver's case, because remember they had the cigarette butt and the carpet that had biological evidence on it, had evidence on it that they could utilize now. And so they resubmit DNA on the Weaver case. Detective Susan Logathetti gets a hit on Weaver, and it comes back to the man who was convicted and sentenced and was in prison for 21 years for the sexual assault of the sisters. We're back to Mr. Gaff again. So this is the part that gets a little fun, I guess, if there can be any fun to this.
It's ingenious.
Yeah, it is. Mitchell Gaff. He's 68 years old. He served time in prison. He's changed his name over the course of the years, Joe, to hide his background. But you can't hide from your DNA. You can change your name. You can do a lot of things, but
yeah, you can do anything you want.
It's not changing your DNA. So when Detective Logathetti got it submitted and got a hit, okay, there's a man right there, and we need to get a current sample, because it's not enough to say we got this old sample from 1984 and we have a hit in the system. You now have to get a current sample from your suspect. And that's where what we started the show with, the gum.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I don't know. Is the term ruse a good term here?
Like the gum trick, the gum ruse.
I love this. I love this. I mean, out of everything I think that we've covered,
brilliant.
This might be one of the more ingenious things. The police portray themselves going door to door.
It sounds like something out of the Brady Bunch. You're leaving the Beaver, man. This does not sound like
the
something...
Fuller Brush man.
Yeah.
The Electrolux vacuum cleaner salesman. This is beautiful. So what they did was that the police, obviously he's on their radar, but they had to get a viable sample. So they're posing as gum company representative salesman. And he, Mitchell Gaff, out of everybody in the world, has been selected to do a test sampling. And what they decided to do was present him with some pairings, if you will. It sounds like official wine stuff, right? It's not a pairing. I'm being facetious. They give him gum, all right? And what do you think, sir, about the taste of this? That was the premise that we're going to use you. You're going to be first, right? And we want to know what your thoughts of. We're thinking about putting this new brand of gum out. Can you do it? And retrospectively, Dave, I got to tell you, there's a fascinating little comment that one of the detectives that was involved in this whole process stated, and I was chuckling to myself. He said, when Gaff deposited, because they had a special receptacle that you had to place the gum back into. When he deposited that gum, they saw a long line of saliva coming out of his mouth. And what is it that pilots say that are bomber pilots? They say we're over the target area.
Yeah, buddy.
Plop right into the container, and they've got this guy's DNA.
And that's exactly what
they've got. This guy's DNA stone cold. And can you imagine? I bet that guy turned around and thanked him profusely. Thank you, sir, for participating.
We might hire
Can you imagine?
Join our board of directors, man.
Yeah, you're going to be the face of the company.
We will be in touch.
We'll be in touch. And boy, were they ever. Because they went out and they compared what they had taken previously, because he was a convicted offender, and compared that with that sample from that gum, and bingo.
Bang, they had him. Judy Weaver.
They were able to close it out. And how'd this wind up, Dave?
They matched him with Judith Weaver. Okay. So now this is where it gets really weird, because you still had Susan Vesey from 4 years earlier. Okay. It was still an unsolved murder. Now, at the time of her murder, remember I told you she was 21, had just 21. Mm-hmm. She's married, 2 little kids. And at the time of her murder, her husband was a big suspect, as was his brother, Jerry. Now, after they get Gaff and they've got him locked up, okay, they've arrested him in the Judith Weaver case. Jerry Vesey died, okay? His brother, Ken Vesey, the husband of Susan. Ken calls the detective and says, hey, my brother Jerry passed away. I was wondering if we could run. I'm thinking he might have suspected that maybe his brother was involved somehow, It was that call, though, that made Detective Logan. She didn't know anything about the Vesey case. Remember how I said earlier you get coming in and out? Well, she knew about Weaver in 84. She didn't know anything about Susan Vesey in 1980. So bing, bang, boom. The husband calling to say, I want this case solved, please. And the detective goes, yeah, well, let's run this. Bang. It was Gaff. So they've got this Mitchell Gaff now. He already served 21 years on the rape of the sisters the sexual assault of the sisters in 84. They've got him for Judith Weaver's 84 murder, and now they've got him for Susan Vesey's murder in 1980. And Joe, as they were getting ready to get all this in court, you know what happened? They found out that 1979 sexual assault that took place in the garage of a woman who became a police officer later. Mitchell Gaff was the guy that did it. They found out all this, and you know how he chose her as a potential victim? The very first victim of Mitchell Gaff. In 1979, he saw her mowing her yard. She's 29 years old, mowing her own yard. Mitchell Gaff saw her as a potential victim. She got away from him, saved her life. Susan Vesey, he got into her house because her door was unlocked. And Judith Weaver, taken by surprise, and he tried to burn his way out of that conviction. He ends up in court. And one of the things that did happen, Joe, is that he ended up pleading guilty. They had him dead to rights. And he gave a statement, which I didn't care about. I care about what the family members of the victim said. You know that 29-year-old from 1979 who became a cop, now she's a retired police officer. She got to take the stand and talk about getting away from him. Yeah, the children of Susan Vesey, who've now grown up, they're adults, grown up. Talk about living life without their mom. And Judith Weaver's family, you know? They got to talk about how other family members died before they knew who was responsible for her murder. Mom, dad, brothers, sisters, all gone. She did have a brother that showed up in court and talked about it. But it all came down to the ingeniousness of a detective getting that sample from a possible suspect without him ever having a clue that she did it. It was amazing.
Yeah, it is. And the numbers don't lie. The numbers will always tell the truth. You can rely upon them if the testing is done correctly and it becomes reliable. It's that benchmark. It's that stake in the sand that we can set forth, that we can rely upon. And the truth will eventually come out. A big tip of the cap to those investigators and those forensic scientists up in Everett that took the time to collect the evidence generations ago. And they held on to that evidence, that they knew that all was not lost. All they had to do was wait, in fact, for the science to catch up with the evidence that they had collected. And the truth prevailed. I think my big question now relative to Gaff, how many others are there? Because, yeah, he did have a pause, but this ember, this flame, if you will, began to burn in him a long, long time ago. And you think about how dark and evil all of this evidence is, everything he did to these victims. Are there others that are out there? Are there those that are unaccounted for that maybe are missing from this particular area? Is there some way they can get information from him? I don't know, because it would be grand if we could give other people answers to these questions that have been gnawing away at families all over the place forever and ever. The truth will, in fact, come home to rest in the science. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bag.